On a quiet morning in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, history was rewritten in a single sentence. President Ibrahim Traoré, just 36 years old, stood on a modest wooden podium draped with the Burkinabè flag. His voice was steady, his tone calm, and yet his words thundered across the globe. The World Bank is no longer welcome in Burkina Faso. For a moment, silence hung in the air. The International Press Corps froze, unsure if they had heard correctly. But then the shock rippled outward like a wave, reaching Washington, Paris, and every corner of the financial world. Burkina Faso, a small, landlocked country, often dismissed as poor and dependent, had just expelled one of the most powerful institutions on earth. This was not the kind of story most people expected to hear from West Africa. For decades, the World Bank had been seen as the lifeline for developing nations, offering loans and aid in exchange for reforms. But those reforms often came with painful consequences: cuts in health care, school closures, and privatization that left ordinary citizens struggling just to survive. In many ways, the World Bank represented not hope, but a chain of dependency. And on that morning, Traoré broke the chain, publicly, defiantly, and without hesitation. Across the streets of Ouagadougou, the reaction was immediate and emotional. Crowds poured into the squares, waving flags and chanting Traoré's name. An elderly farmer, interviewed by local radio, captured the spirit of the moment. "We may eat little today, but we will eat what is ours, not what they force upon us." For him, and for millions like him, this was not about economics. It was about dignity. Meanwhile, in the West, disbelief quickly turned into fear. In Washington, U.S., officials gathered for an emergency meeting at the Treasury Department. In Paris, diplomats scrambled to coordinate with the IMF. Could this small African nation spark a domino effect, inspiring others to break free from decades of financial control? For the world's most powerful economies, that was a nightmare scenario. But for the people of Burkina Faso, it was a dream finally coming true. And so we must ask, why would a nation so vulnerable, so reliant on foreign aid, dare to take such a bold and dangerous step? When President Ibrahim Traoré announced that the World Bank was no longer welcome in Burkina Faso, it was not a decision made overnight. It was the culmination of decades of frustration, hardship, and broken promises. For years, the World Bank had presented itself as a partner to Burkina Faso, offering billions in loans and development packages. But for ordinary Burkinabè citizens, those loans felt like invisible chains. Hospitals closed because health budgets were slashed. Schools collapsed under the weight of austerity. Farmers saw their subsidies vanish, while foreign corporations gained easier access to markets. What was framed as progress often meant pain. To understand why this announcement shocked the world, you have to see the numbers. By the early 2000s, Burkina Faso was spending more on debt repayments to international lenders than on education and healthcare combined. Entire generations grew up believing that progress was always one more loan away, always at the end of another round of cuts and sacrifices. The system was designed to keep them dependent. Traoré studied this reality closely. He once told his advisors, "If loans could make us rich, Africa would already be the richest continent on earth." But beyond the statistics were the faces of ordinary people. Take the story of Mariam, a schoolteacher in Ouagadougou. When foreign-imposed reforms cut public funding, her school struggled to pay salaries. For 3 months, she worked without pay, teaching children from wooden benches under a leaking roof. Parents brought her small gifts of rice and corn just to help her survive. When she heard the Traoré's announcement, she wept on live television. "This is not just about money," she said. "This is about our children's future." Or consider Issa, a farmer in the Sahel region. When subsidies for grain were cut, he could no longer afford fertilizer. His harvests shrank, and he fell deeper into debt. Each year, he wondered how he could feed his family. The World Bank loans promised to modernize agriculture, but in Issa's village, fields dried up and young men left for the city. On the night of the expulsion, Issa joined the crowd celebrating. He raised his hands and shouted, "No more chains! We will plant with our own hands." So, when Traoré stood at that podium, the reaction in Burkina Faso was not fear, it was relief. Citizens knew the decision would bring short-term pain. Road projects funded by the World Bank might stall. Some hospitals would face shortages. Salaries could be delayed. But to them, these were sacrifices worth making. For the first time, they felt their leader was putting dignity above dependency. The international response, however, was immediate and severe. In Washington, think tanks warned of an existential threat to the global financial order. Treasury officials called emergency meetings, fearing a domino effect across Africa. In Paris, government advisors whispered that France's influence in its former colonies was eroding faster than expected. Even at the World Bank headquarters, leaked memos admitted the truth. If Burkina Faso survived without them, the institution's credibility across the global south would collapse. And yet in Ouagadougou the people were calm. They had been preparing quietly for this moment. Traoré had already launched domestic initiatives. A national development fund fueled by local businesses, diaspora contributions, and even small savings from citizens. He had worked with Mali and Niger to create the blueprint for a Sahel Investment Bank, an institution built by Africans for Africans. He had diversified partnerships with countries like Turkey, Russia, and China, ensuring that Burkina Faso would never again be trapped by a single master. Step by step, he was dismantling the cage of dependency. This is why the question being asked today carries so much weight. Is the decision to expel the World Bank a reckless move that could bring Burkina Faso down, or is it the beginning of a true era of independence for Africa? The answer depends on perspective. From the West, it looks reckless. Economists warn of collapse. Investors fear instability. But from the ground in Burkina Faso, it feels like rebirth. Citizens are already proving their resilience by supporting schools, volunteering in communities, and standing united behind their leader. They are willing to endure hardship today for the promise of freedom tomorrow. For older Americans watching, the story may feel familiar. It recalls moments in history when nations took risks for independence, when people were willing to sacrifice comfort for sovereignty. It raises unsettling but necessary questions about global stability. Could a small African nation really shake the foundations of the international order? Could this bold move inspire others to follow? The truth is, Burkina Faso has already changed the conversation. What seemed impossible a year ago is now reality. The chains of dependency have been challenged. The only question left is, but what caused this turning point? The moment of climax came not in the quiet announcement itself, but in the waves of reaction that followed. In Ouagadougou, the streets filled like a rising tide. Men, women, and children carried torches and flags. Drums echoed into the night, pounding like a heartbeat of defiance. For ordinary people who had lived through decades of dependency, this was not just news. It was history unfolding before their eyes. President Ibrahim Traoré emerged from the presidential palace later that evening, not in military fatigues, but in a simple white shirt. He walked among the crowds without fear, surrounded not by walls of security but by the embrace of his people. Elderly men reached out to touch his hand. Mothers lifted their children onto their shoulders so they could see the young president who had dared to defy the most powerful financial institution in the world. In that moment, Traoré was no longer just a head of state. He was a symbol, a living reminder that dignity is worth more than debt. The emotional intensity was undeniable. A young musician climbed onto a rooftop with his guitar, playing a song he had written only hours before. The lyrics, simple and raw, carried across the streets. No more chains, no more fear. The crowd sang with him, their voices shaking the night air. It felt less like a protest and more like a liberation ceremony. But while Burkina Faso celebrated, the corridors of power elsewhere trembled. In Washington, policy experts warned of strategic consequences. At the Council on Foreign Relations, One analyst admitted, if Burkina Faso succeeds, the entire post-war development model could collapse. In Paris, French officials spoke in alarm, calling Traoré's act an attack on the international order. At World Bank headquarters, a staff quietly whispered that their greatest fear was not the loss of one country, but the loss of authority itself. For the Burkinabè people, the stakes were personal. For Western capitals, the stakes were global. And the tension between those two realities created the perfect storm. The high point of emotion came when state television broadcast images of villagers lighting bonfires in remote towns. In one scene, elders in traditional robes poured libations of water onto the ground, praying for Traoré's protection. In another, students marched with handwritten signs, "We will build with our own hands." These were not choreographed displays. They were spontaneous, born of a people who finally felt seen and heard. Yet for every tear of joy in Burkina Faso, there was a shiver of fear in the West. Could this spark spread? Could it reach Mali, Niger, or even larger economies like Nigeria and South Africa? The question hung in the air like thunder before a storm. It leads us to the second great question of this story. If a small nation like Burkina Faso dares to challenge the global financial system, what might happen if larger African countries follow the same path? The answer is both inspiring and unsettling. If larger nations joined this defiance, Africa could reshape its destiny, free from outside control. But it could also fracture the global financial order, sending shockwaves through markets and geopolitics. For older Americans watching, the comparison is clear. It feels like the Cold War once again, a test of courage that could change the balance of power for generations. In Burkina Faso, the night ended with hope. Crowds dispersed not in chaos but in unity. Families walked home together, still singing. Parents told their children they had witnessed something they would remember forever. A nation long overlooked was finally standing tall. But beyond the celebrations, a looming question remained. How would the world respond? Would the great powers punish Burkina Faso to set an example? Or would they quietly adapt to a new reality in which Africa had more control over its own future? Will the world act in time? Before we continue, I want to ask you, our viewers, what you think. Do you believe Burkina Faso's bold decision is the start of a new era of freedom or the beginning of dangerous instability? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and share this video if you believe the story of Africa deserves to be heard worldwide. The decision to expel the World Bank did not stay confined to the speeches of politicians or the debates of economists. It landed directly in the daily lives of the Burkinabè people. Almost overnight, projects tied to World Bank funding slowed down. Road construction crews were forced to halt midway through laying pavement. In one rural hospital, shipments of imported medicine stalled, leaving shelves half empty. Teachers worried about delayed salaries. These were not abstract economic issues. They were felt in the homes of ordinary families. Yet what might have sparked unrest in other nations did not produce riots in Burkina Faso. Instead, communities adapted. Local cooperatives organized food drives. Villagers in Koudougou pooled resources to keep their primary school open when government funds dried up. In Ouagadougou, groups of university students volunteered to tutor younger children for free, determined not to let education collapse. What the world saw as chaos, the Burkinabè experienced as a test of resilience. The numbers were stark. For years, nearly 30% of Burkina Faso's national budget was tied to aid and loans from foreign institutions like the World Bank. With that stream suddenly cut, short-term hardship was inevitable. But instead of panic, there was a wave of self-reliance. Citizens began donating small amounts to the new National Development Fund. A market vendor gave the equivalent of just $1, saying proudly, "It is not much, but it is mine. It will build my country, not theirs." Thousands of similar contributions added up, becoming a powerful act of national solidarity. Politically, the impact was just as profound. In Parliament, even opposition figures who had criticized Traoré in the past now rallied behind him. "We cannot afford division at this hour," one lawmaker said. Across the Sahel, leaders in Mali and Niger praised the move, hinting that their own governments might reconsider their ties to the World Bank. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso was not being spoken about as a weak, dependent nation, but as a catalyst for continental change. The symbolism also mattered deeply. Images of farmers marching with hoes on their shoulders, shouting, "We will feed ourselves," went viral across African social media. Radio stations broadcast songs celebrating Traoré's defiance. Intellectuals described the decision as the rebirth of sovereignty. For older generations who had lived through colonialism, it felt like a long-delayed victory. But beneath the pride lay real challenges. Inflation ticked upward as foreign investors pulled back. Imported goods became harder to find. In the capital, some families struggled to afford cooking oil and rice. The hardship was undeniable. And yet, unlike in the past, people saw these struggles as temporary and self-chosen, not imposed by distant institutions. That difference changed everything. Internationally, the political consequences multiplied. In Washington, policymakers debated whether to punish or engage. Some argued that Burkina Faso must be made an example, warning that defiance could spread like wildfire across Africa. Others urged caution, recognizing that heavy-handed retaliation might backfire and deepen anti-Western sentiment. At the same time, in Paris, French officials privately admitted that their influence in West Africa was eroding faster than they could control. Back in Burkina Faso, President Traoré addressed the nation directly, speaking not from a grand hall but from a simple community center surrounded by families. His words were calm but firm. "We will face difficulties, yes, but better a few months of sacrifice than a lifetime of chains." His honesty resonated. Parents nodded, children clapped, and elders whispered prayers for his safety. For older American viewers, this resonates with themes they know well: sacrifice for freedom, unity in the face of hardship, and the belief that dignity matters more than comfort. It also raises unsettling questions about global stability. If Burkina Faso can endure, might others follow? And if they do, how will the West react to a continent no longer willing to bow? The civil and political consequences of Traoré's bold move are not measured only in numbers or policies, but in the spirit of a people rediscovering their independence. Every sacrifice strengthens their conviction. Every challenge deepens their unity. What looked like weakness has become resilience. What seemed like recklessness has turned into leadership. But one question remains, hanging in the air for Washington and beyond. But how will the U.S. respond? Around the world, the reaction to Traoré's defiance was swift and divided. In Europe, headlines screamed, "Burkina Faso expels World Bank," with commentators calling it either economic suicide or a spark of liberation. In Paris, officials were shaken. For France, long used to influence in its former colonies, Traoré's action was a humiliating reminder that the old order was collapsing. Across the European Union, diplomats debated how to respond, torn between pressure and caution. But the center of gravity in this story was Washington. In the United States, policymakers recognized immediately that this was not just about Burkina Faso. It was about global stability and America's own national security interests. At the Treasury Department, analysts warned that if other nations followed Traoré's lead, the ability of Western institutions to shape world economies would be permanently weakened. At the Pentagon, strategists asked what this would mean for U.S. influence in Africa, a continent rich in minerals essential for modern technology and defense. The media in America reflected the same divide. Some networks painted Traoré as reckless, a radical populist threatening to plunge his people into chaos. Others framed him as a symbol of resistance, the kind of leader who dared to say no to global systems that many ordinary Americans themselves distrust. For older viewers, it struck a chord. Memories of the Cold War, when small nations stood up to superpowers, resurfaced. The question became, was this another moment where a seemingly minor event could reshape the balance of power? What alarmed U.S. officials most was the possibility of a domino effect. If Burkina Faso could break free and survive, what would stop larger African nations, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, from considering the same? For Washington, that raised not only economic questions but also strategic ones. Could America afford to lose influence in a region vital to global trade and security? Could China or Russia step in to fill the vacuum, threatening U.S. interests directly? The issue was not simply about loans or development projects. It was about credibility, control, and the future of America's role in the world. If Washington responded too harshly, through sanctions or pressure, it risked fueling anti-American sentiment. If it responded too softly, it risked looking weak. This delicate balance mirrored the very fears that have haunted U.S. foreign policy for decades. For everyday Americans, the implications were closer than they appeared. Minerals from Africa power smartphones, electric cars, even U.S. defense systems. Instability in Africa affects migration, terrorism, and global markets. A small nation like Burkina Faso might seem distant, but its choices echo in the lives of American families more than most realize. And so the world watches. On one side stands a young African leader who refuses to bow. On the other, the great powers of the West struggling to maintain control. The standoff raises a question that cannot be ignored. Is this the beginning of a larger crisis? The story of Burkina Faso's bold defiance does not end with celebration in the streets of Ouagadougou. It carries a warning that this act of independence could unleash a chain of consequences across the Sahel and beyond. The region is already fragile, scarred by insurgencies, coups, and economic hardship. If more nations follow Traoré's path, the West's grip on Africa may weaken, but instability could also rise. The stakes are not just African, they are global. Imagine a near future where Mali, Niger, and Guinea join Burkina Faso in rejecting the World Bank. Imagine if Nigeria, Africa's giant, takes a similar stand. In that scenario, the foundations of the global financial order, carefully built over decades, would begin to crack. Investors would panic, Western governments would scramble, and powers like China and Russia would step into the vacuum, reshaping Africa's alliances overnight. What looks like a victory for sovereignty could also become a new battleground for influence, with ordinary people caught in the middle. For the Burkinabè people, however, this is a fight worth having. They are tired of living on loans that never end. They are ready to build with their own hands, even if it means sacrifice. And that is what makes this moment both inspiring and dangerous. So we are left with the central question. Is Ibrahim Traoré a hope for Africa's future, or a threat that could plunge the continent into deeper crisis? For some, he is a visionary, breaking chains that have bound nations for too long. For others, he is a reckless gambler risking his people's survival. The truth may lie somewhere in between. But either way, history will remember this moment. And now it comes to you. What do you believe? If you see Traoré as a symbol of courage, share this story so others can hear it. If you believe Africa's path matters for global stability, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters. Because stories like this are not just about Africa. They are about all of us. The world is watching Burkina Faso. The question is not only what Traoré will do next, but how the world will respond, and whether we are prepared for the storm that may follow.